Hey, Patrick, don't forget to start recording.
Thanks, buddy.
Yeah, you got it.
This is going to be a pretty informal session, but I wanted a chance for folks to kind of get an introduction to what it means when we say, hey, who wants to help with doing some PnPjs version 2 work? So we're going to take a look at doing that today. Hey, that's what we're in right now. So to start with, I've got my project down here, and we're forked. And I'm assuming at this point, folks have got a development environment set up, and so we're not gonna do that part of this. I'm gonna assume you've got your development environment, you know how to fork a repo, and so forth. But one of the first things, and this is something Julie actually pointed out yesterday is a great thing to mention, is we should always, before we start, we should refresh our local copy from the upstream source. So I have a fork, right, in my Patrick Rogers part of GitHub, and I need to pull the latest code from the main PnPjs part of GitHub. And the way you do that is just do a pull command, but you specify your target and where you want to pull from. So in my case, I have a remote called upstream, which is the PnPjs repo. And so I'm just going to hit pull, and I'm already up to date because I do that about 100 times a day. But you would see maybe some changes come in, just like if you did a pull to your local repository. So great. So I want to help with PnPjs. What do I do? How do I get started? So the first thing you want to do is come to the issues list. And David and Simon have done a great job of going through and creating a whole bunch of issues. So it looks like we have a ton of issues right now, and we do, but all of these ones that are prefixed with 2.0 are part of the 2.0 work. And so the way you get started is you'd come in here and say, I want to work on a submodule. Patrick, what is a submodule? Great question. So this is the code, and we're going to go back to the issues list in a second, but I think it's important to see in the code, under the source folder, you'll see now each of the things, excuse me, each of the things is a folder now as opposed to just a file. And we're going to look at regional settings today, so I'm going to pick on that as an example. But you can see in here it has its own index file and some other files we'll look at shortly, so don't worry about those quite yet. But this is what I mean and what we are referring to as a submodule. And these are the things that allow us to do the selective imports in the code in the library. And so what we're going to do is say, well, I want to work on the regional settings. This is a pretty small one. I think I can handle this. There's nothing too complicated in here. I get what's going on. I want to do regional settings. And I picked this one specifically for today because it's small. So you would come in here, and you would look at the issue, and you're going to see this stuff. We're going to go over what all this means in a second. But your first step is to come in here and simply comment, hey, I would like to work on this issue, and please sign me up. And what will happen then is one of Simon, David, or Julie, and I'm going to take a second now to introduce the three of them. And if you all care to introduce yourselves, we can do that too. I think you're all on the call. Do you all want to say two things about yourselves?
Oh, sure. Let's do that.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Julie Turner. I work for some Praxis Consulting, and I'm in the Boston, Massachusetts area of the United States. That's the East Coast of the United States. Welcome, everybody.
And then David?
Hey, everybody. This is David Warner. I am working for Catapult. Happy to be helping out, and I live in Los Angeles.
He's a movie star. And then Simon, if you can hear us. I know you're having...
Hey, everybody.
Oh, good.
Simon. We say in Swedish, Ågren. Doesn't matter. I live in Sweden, by the way. And I work for a company called Sogeti, part of Capgemini, so big company. And yeah, you could reach out to me if you need some help or anything. Cool.
Perfect. Yeah, so the three of them have graciously offered their time to help with this. And I really appreciate it. We all really appreciate it. And they've been doing great work so far and will continue to do so. But what will happen is one of them will come in here, and in my case, they didn't comment back and say anything to me because it's, we all talk anyway. but they would say something like, hey, great, let us know if you need any help, right? And then we'll move the status from help wanted to in progress. And so what that means is you are now working on that issue. So I am working on this issue. So I'm going to do regional settings. So we've created these checklists to help kind of guide you through what needs to be done or what we think needs to be done. Of course, as you're looking at the code in the different submodules, you might see other things. And if you have ideas to make things a little bit better, that's of course welcome. If you're not sure, just reach out. You can comment right back on this issue with, hey, David. Wow, typing for me this morning is not going well. Hey, David, I found a thing, and let's talk about changing line 213. Just as an example, right? You could spell things correctly if you want. That's optional. But that's the kind of thing we are looking for you to be empowered to do. If you have ideas, let us know. Let's talk them through. Please don't make any crazy changes without talking to us, but definitely want you all to have the freedom to make some changes and do some things if you see opportunities to make things better. But so coming back to the checklist, the first one is pretty self-explanatory, but some of the code still has some to-dos in it from could be years ago at this point. There could be blocks of commented out code, and then we want to ensure all our interfaces are prefixed with an I. Wow, we're good. This should be now using await, and I've just noticed that typo. So we're changing all the internals of the library to use await. Okay, unfortunate typo there. So let's just get started, and we're going to come in here, and I don't have any to-dos in this code. I know that because I already looked. So there's nothing to do here, and the to-dos, you could either do those to-dos, or you could look at it and decide this is no longer relevant, or this isn't a thing that's important, or whatever. Make a decision if you want to talk it through. Again, just comment on the issue. Our other thing is commented out code. So you're going to see blocks of code in places that are just commented out. Like you might see some properties and methods that are commented out, and there might be something here like, doesn't work with latest SPO or something. I'm making that up. You can just delete that code. We have source control. We have version control. We don't need to keep blocks of commented out code just hanging around. And then interface is prefixed with an I. And so I'm going to actually drag this over here so I don't have to keep flashing the screen to remind myself what we're doing. So all of these files now have sets of interfaces, and we'll talk through each of these bits of code and what they mean in a second. But you want to make sure all the interfaces that are defined here already have I's in front of them. And so here's some interfaces here. These all have I's. Great. So that's done. Good to go there. And so the last thing is we want to make sure we're using await anywhere we can. So what that means is old style, we used to use then. So we would do things like this. Like I said, typing is not going well for me. Whoops. Let v equals null, and we're just going to say v equals this, and then we might return v. This isn't good code. Like we would wrap this in a promise and do it correctly here. But the general idea is we were using then instead of await. And the reason for that is a lot of stuff didn't support await when we first started this, or support was spotty. But now support for await is pretty good, and we don't have to include as much the TS helper code for awaits. So if you ever looked at the code, if you transpiled code using await, you got big blocks of generator code to make that await function, in an environment that maybe doesn't support it. So what you can do is just rewrite code to use await. So what await does is essentially, not essentially, it does work exactly like async await in like C# for example. So we're saying we have an operation that returns a promise, and so we're just simply going to wait for that promise to complete. And then the final thing you have to do is you have to tag that function as async. So we've got an async function. We're awaiting a result here, and we're good to go. Then we can return our result. So awesome. So we've done the first thing in our checklist, and I'm going to check that off. And so, sorry, was that, anybody have a question? Cool. So the next thing on our checklist is ensure that every property and method has a test. One of the things we didn't do a great job of in the past is having test coverage for everything that we're doing. And so with version 2, we're going to make sure we have test coverage for everything we're doing. That sounds like a very daunting task, and it is going to be a fair amount of work, which is why we're enlisting as much help as we can get. But the tests can be fairly simple. I understand this is, my volunteered time, you all's volunteered time. We don't need to spend 500 hours writing 11 million tests on regional settings, for example. So what I've done is, and this is using Mocha. So for those of you that might be familiar with Mocha, this is the Mocha format or pattern, if you will, where you can have different sort of closures around like a describe. So we're describing regional settings. And then up here, we're importing some stuff. Expect. So Chai is another library. It's a testing library, Mocha and Chai. And then we're importing the stuff we need from our libraries. And then this test settings is, we'll take a look at in a second. But what we're saying here is if the web tests are enabled, and there are scenarios where they would not be, we want to run these tests. And so we're doing that because these all make requests. So if the web tests are disabled, we don't want to run them, right? I think that makes sense. So then we're simply checking to see if I invoke the regional settings, basically request the regional settings for this web, does this promise eventually fulfill successfully? And so again, this is just Mocha and Chai syntax, so you can look up the docs there on how this all works. They've got great docs, both libraries, on how these different things work and how to construct these tests. And you can also use the other files that we've already done as a starting point as well as examples. So we're just checking to see all these things have been fulfilled. Another thing you might notice is we're using function here instead of like arrow notation. And the reason for that is the way Mocha works behind the scenes, it's really pretty slick, but it attaches essentially this function to a prototype. So you're going to get a this that's associated with your test here that's scoped to that test. And you have various operations off of that. For example, you can set the timeout. If you need a different timeout, you can set it to 0 if you have a really long running operation and have no timeout. And there's some other things in here that you can use within your test. And you'll actually see, in a few places where we're setting, oops, don't need that line there, where we're setting the timeout and stuff like that. So just use the function notation, and that's a quirk of just how Mocha works. So we want to use that. The arrow notation will work, but we're just trying to follow the guidelines for Mocha on that. So then you can see we're doing a couple different little tests here. Can we select different operations? You'll notice again, we're not using get. So this is the invocable pattern that's going to be in version 2, well, that is already in version 2. So the default operation, you can simply invoke as a function the actual chain of things. So sp.web.regional settings, it works for any of it. So you could get, sp.web, you can invoke that now and get the web results without doing .get. So you can see we've done this for the other things. We're doing other operations. And then I want to add a test. So let's walk through adding a test. So my test is going to be, we want to test for get by ID. If we look back at the code, and we look back at the code, look back at the code, look back at the code. So in this particular method, we actually are getting back a merged result. So this is one of the things the library can do. But in this case, getting the time zone by ID is such a quick operation that it doesn't make sense. Like 99 times out of 10, your next operation is going to be to load this, right? So instead of forcing people to do a get by ID and then invoke that, we're invoking that for them, assuming they're going to want that time zone information. And then they'll get a time zone object, time zone instance back. So they're going to get an interface that implements, where is iTimeZone? iTimeZone. And they're also going to get, that's merged with now the iTimeZone info, which if we go find that guy, is here. So this is actually what comes back for each time zone. So one of the things I did as part of my work in this submodule was I actually added these interfaces. So we didn't have these before. So we've added regional settings info, we've added the installed language info, and the time zone info. So this is data that comes back from those methods. Really, these should all just be partials, but I'll fix that later. So we're going to get this merged object back. So I want to write a test that does something with that. So I'm going to call it used. And in terms of what these names should be, they should just be descriptive enough that if that test is failing, we can find it, we can understand where to look, and we can get it. So in writing my tests here, one thing I can do is this function can be async. That works fine with Mocha. And I'm going to copy this line. We're going to set it there. And what I want to do is I'm going to take this part out, and I'm going to say const tz is await this. So now we're invoking that. We're getting our time zone object back. It's going to have data in it, right? So we can do something like, we can say expect tz to have, well, we could just say have own property, and let's go back and look. What property does time zone info have? It should have a description, right? So we'll say description. And then we can also, and by the way, you'll see here, the IntelliSense does give you all those properties because we're merging the interface here. So you should find this somewhere. It says description, ID, and information. So that's coming off of the two merged interfaces. And then the other thing we want to do is let's expect, so we have operations we can run on that time zone object. And I want to say time zone dot, let's go back here. And what's something I can do with a time zone once I have it? Well, I can call it, has these two methods, right? So we're already testing those methods down here. So I don't really care exactly about testing them, but I do want to see, I'm just going to copy this one. But I just want to see here that this object we've got back, I am able to invoke the methods on it, right? Because we expect that this get by ID gives us an instance merged with the data. We're going to expect it to have a property. We're going to expect it to do that. Awesome. So we've written a test. We're done. Sort of. We have to test our test. So one of the neat things about Mocha you can do is this only. So if you say only, and you can do this at any level, so either this level or you can do it up here at describe, you could say only. You could do it on multiple things. So you could have two, we're going to run 2 tests, 3, 4, 6, whatever. But we only want to run this one test, right? Great. How do we run a test? Great question. So npm, bpm npm test, and run it. So in the past, in version 1, and since we've done PnPjs, we've used gulp. Gulp is awesome. I love gulp. I have no problem with gulp, but we're no longer using gulp. And we've replaced gulp with scripts, npm scripts. And what really enabled that is pretty much all the tools we use now, and we'll take a look at some of these in a second, support code as configuration. So you can have a configuration file that is a JS file or a TS file instead of a static JSON file. So the dynamic functionality we were putting in gulp is now we're able to put in those configuration files and just take gulp out. And that's just really about taking a dependency out of the stuff we have to keep updated every month. So certainly, absolutely not a knock on gulp. So we've run our test, and you can see we've invoked this NYC Mocha. Well, what's NYC? NYC is a coverage tool, and we'll look at the results hopefully here in a second. And so NYC and Mocha have been built to just auto-magically work together, which is super cool. So your command line is NYC Mocha. And we'll look at here in a second in the config files, but I'm dumping out the generated Mocha config mostly as a sanity check to myself and to anybody else using this, so I can see if the commands or the flags I've entered have been picked up correctly as I'm using this. Hey, our one test passed? That's great. And then we got a whole ton of junk. What's all this junk? Great question. This is our coverage report. So we can see our one test passed. Yay, us. But we've got all this coverage stuff. So this is, for those of you who might not be familiar with what code coverage means around tests, these are all of the functions and things that have tests associated with them. What's interesting about this is this report is very wrong. So we're not using this for anything at this point. But what it will allow you to do as you're working on your, our regional settings, so you can see I've been working on regional settings, and these numbers as I was working have all gone up, right? So that's kind of what we're aiming for, is to increase our usage. I think right now it says something about your test fail, you didn't hit the global threshold of 90% coverage. You 100% ignore that for now. I haven't decided what we're going to do with this, if we're even really going to care about this coverage report, because it hasn't been super accurate so far. But, you can kind of ignore that for now. It's not going to stop you from checking in your code. It's not something that we're going to really look at. We're more concerned that you can come in here and we can see that all the tests are there. Cool. So I'm going to take that only off, so we can make sure that our other tests will now all run. But that's neat. So we've got our test. It passed, which means that this operation worked. This object had this own property description, and we were able to successfully invoke this method, and it eventually was fulfilled, right? So the reason I'm keeping these tests simple and want you all to keep these tests simple is, one, time, right? It takes a lot of time, but I want to get basic tests out there. And then what will happen in the future is somebody shows up and reports an issue with time zones for something, right? So the first thing we'll do at that point, and we're going to start enforcing this, is we're going to say, this is a test, this is issue 123, and this is going to be a test that when we write it, fails because the code is broken. And then when we fix it, we see that this test will now pass, right? So we're going to duplicate whatever that issue is reporting, see that it's broken, do a fix, see that the test now passes, right? And so these tests will expand and grow kind of organically over time, right? It's just too much to sit down, because I know all of us have been on projects with somebody that was like, we have to have 11,000 tests. We've got to sit here and go, well, what if, because there's how many time zone IDs? Maybe like 50. We have to get each one. We have to test each one. No, they're all the same, right? If we can get one, I assume they're all going to work, right? So let's not go down a rabbit hole with writing a million tests, but let's get decent, good coverage of all the things just to see that they work, right? Because I assume the SharePoint API works. That if I get a successful result, I assume that I'm getting back a time zone or the collection of time zones and so forth, right? I don't need to investigate deep down into those results or things like that. Here I'm checking because I want to make sure that property is there. So let's pause. Are there any questions on what we've gone over so far? I'm kind of counting on everybody here in the call to be the voice of everybody that's not here in the call. So if I'm saying something that's maybe not super clear, please, you could, is there something in the IM window? Oh, here we go. Let's see. Nope, jokes. Well, 100% branch coverage be required for first PR on a submodule? Yes. So what we are, 100% coverage, not 100% coverage in that report, right? So like we're not going to look at, when we review these, I'm not going to look here and demand or expect these numbers to be 100% because in some cases they just won't be, right? And in some cases, like there are no tests being run for user custom actions right now, and it's 100%. So this isn't going to be what we look at. What we're going to look at, yeah, this is also a V2 requirement to the second question there. So what we're going to look at when we review these is I'm going to literally open this file. So this is regional settings, and I'm going to go through here and be like, all right, there's these three things here. Cool, we're calling those three things, right? And really just eyeball it. And that's how we're going to verify it. And if we see something missing, we'll just comment on your PR and be like, hey, cool, can we, can you add a test for XYZ, right? So on branching, we should branch from dev v2 and PR to dev v2. Yes. So if you are working on v2, the dev branch and the dev v2 branch have no relationship. You can't go back and forth between the two. The dev v2 branch is completely reset. So you'll want to just pull down the repo, switch to the dev v2 branch in your fork, do your work there, and then send your PR back to the dev v2 branch at the upstream or at the origin, however you want to refer to that.
And Vincent,
Yeah.
that's a really good question. I'll get that added to the README too. And just for anybody else, you probably have already seen this, but I'm going to paste it in. There's the README in the V2. It's very short, but it's got some FAQs, so feel free to share that with others who either are not on this call but want to get involved, and or obviously you're going to be able to share the video with them at that point too, but just wanted to make that mention. And we'll try to keep that updated along the way with some of these questions that seem like kind of, oh yeah, basic, good questions that we don't already have in there.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. And David, I think, wrote that README, and Julie and Simon have contributed there too, and so it's really good stuff. If someone is keen to do project online, there's a few people talking about project. I mean, I'm all for it. So if folks can get together on that, but it's not on my list as a dependency for getting V2 going. But if folks want to work on it, absolutely 100% encourage that. I think that'd be a great addition. It's probably an entirely new library or new, library, I guess, or new library or package, I guess I should say. Yeah, thank you. My brain is just slowly braining this morning. So we've written some tests. That's awesome. Let's look real quick at the code so we can kind of understand a little bit of the V2 and how it operates. We have already done the structural changes to the code, so you don't have to do any V2-oriented refactoring. That work should already be done in all of these submodules. But I think it's important for us to take a few minutes and just kind of step through what we've done, and for me to explain to all of you why we've made the choices we've made. And, of course, always welcome feedback on this stuff, but to be super honest, some of it's going to be just how it is at this point. So we've got classes still. And one of the things we're really changing, I want to look at this index. So these index files are exactly like the index in another module. This is what's getting exported from the regional settings submodule. And we'll see that in usage in a little bit. So the only things we're exporting are interfaces and these factory functions. Okay? And then you'll see this import web, and we'll talk about what that is doing here in a second. But so these classes, we aren't on purpose exposing them to the world anymore. It's JavaScript. You can obviously always get to them, right, if you want to, but we're not trying to expose them. And the reason for that is because starting with V2, if we only give people interfaces and factory functions, we can change the guts of this to do whatever we want moving forward, right? We could get rid of these class implementations and have some kind of generated partials. We do all kinds of crazy stuff, right? And that won't break anybody so long as we stay true to those contracts we've handed everybody. Those contracts being the interfaces and factory functions. So the factory function, in the past, you may have done something like new web blah, right, and given it a URL. The only difference is now you just call web and give it the URL. The signature stays the same, and you can give it additional path there too. The signature stays the same. You just drop the new keyword in your code for the factory functions. But we have these classes that actually implement the functionality, right? We need the methods have to live somewhere, or the properties have to live somewhere. So they live on these classes. And we're extending the same kind of things. In this case, SharePoint, there's a queryable instance, and there's a queryable collection. And then we're implementing this underscore iRegional settings. So this is a bit, and I'm going to ask somebody to drop on mute if, oh, bye, Julie. This is a bit of TypeScript juggling to make things work in the TypeScript type system correctly. This isn't something you'll ever have to do in your code. You can ignore it, but it's here to build up the interfaces in the way we need them to be built up. But what this does is this creates a relationship between this interface and this so that we know that this class implements this interface. So that gives us a bit of type check there. But this is the interface we actually are exporting. And so you can see we're extending this interface, and then we're extending a couple of other things. So we're extending iInvocable, and we'll look at what that is in a second. And then we're extending the iQueryable SharePoint. And this generic type parameter here is the default action result, which in our case is result settings info. So let's, I'm going to move pretty fast through this. There's a lot to cover. If you have questions, please, type them in the window. I want to try and answer them. So let me drag that over there so I can see the window as I'm talking. So let's look at invocable real quick, and we can't go to it doesn't, yeah. Sometimes the linking up in VS Code is really great, and sometimes it's really less great. So let's look at the invocable interface. The only thing it's doing is essentially saying this object can also be invoked as a function, right? And so we're creating this idea of a hybrid object that is both an object and a function, which is one of the cute things you can do in JavaScript, and creates and lets us have that syntax that is web, and just invoke it, right? Ignore whatever just happened there. And we can just invoke it as a function, or we have all the well, I don't have the type check here, but you can do all the IntelliSense for the properties and methods and things as you need. So the way this is built up is through a bunch of functional binding, which happy to talk through this with folks if they're interested on another call. I don't want to spend a ton of time on it here. But at the heart of all this is a proxy object. So if you're not familiar with this, this is a capability that allows you in JavaScript to intercept any call into an object. And so this is how we're able, and I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole on this call because this is about writing tests and getting through our checklist, but I want you all to kind of have an idea of what's going on because I hope as you get into writing this, you'll be interested in looking into the code and maybe learn something, or maybe have questions, maybe have ideas on making stuff better. But this proxy is how we're able to do extension methods, how we're able to extend the different classes, how we're able to or how we're going to be able to apply different, logging patterns and different method intercept patterns in the future. One example of that might be behind the scenes. We might be able to, for example, rewrite requests in the SP library to actually hit the Microsoft Graph. That's an example, right? And it's, again, all of that being invisible to people because we're just giving them interfaces and factory functions. So anyway, don't want to dive into the invocable stuff. Really happy if folks are interested in that. Have a look at it. Super happy to talk through it at some point. And then this is us creating our factory. Again, this work has been done, so I don't anticipate anyone needing to do it, but I think it's important to understand it. So what we're saying is let's create an SP invocable factory. If you're working in the graph library, there's also a graph invocable factory function. And what that does is just create up the method signatures. And then we're giving it a generic parameter of this is what this factory will produce. So our regional settings factory produces regional settings instances. And this is the concrete class that it's going to use in that invocable functional binding stuff we looked at briefly just a second ago. So it's going to take that class, merge it with the function, add some other stuff, and wrap it in a proxy. Boom, there's your factory. So, neat. So let's look back at our checklist of stuff. So our next checklist of stuff, every property and method has at least one test. Great. Ensure that all the interfaces, methods, and properties are commented. So what we've done is because we have these interfaces and because we're exposing these interfaces to the public, these interfaces are where the comment should live because this is actually what will appear like in VS Code or Visual Studio where you're getting your IntelliSense. So we want to comment the interfaces, not the classes. So for example, we come down here to the time zone class and we have this super helpful description here. Describes the time zone data. We're just going to take that off because no one will ever see it. And we're going to put that on the interface, right? And so you can see this interface. I've done a lot of this because I didn't want y'all to spend time watching me, type comments. But so same thing, we'll just move that comment down. If you see places where, like for example here, we're merging the time zone instance in that way I talked about before, if you see places in the code that we need some code comments for, 6 months from now when we forget what we're doing, just go ahead and add them in, right? All of you should feel empowered to do what you think is best to make the library better, right? Like I said, if you're not sure on something, just ask us. But y'all are smart. Y'all know what you're doing. So I anticipate you having ideas we haven't had to make things better. So that add comments, maybe, change methods a little bit. This is a major release, so we can change method signatures. We can, it can be breaking changes. That's totally okay. And then we've got some other interfaces here that I'm just going to, for example, here say, this is the data for regional settings, right? That's a dumb comment, but it gets the job done. So let's come up here. And so that's good. So everything's got comments. I feel good about the comments now in this file. Remove comments from class implementations. So that's kind of what we talked about a second ago. There's no point in having the comments in both places. There's no point in having them just on the class. No one will ever see them. So I'm going to check that one off. And I'm going to say, ensure the docs page is updated. Great. So we wrote our tests. We've moved the tests now out to our own test folder. This is, again, a lot of the testing frameworks just assume you have a folder named test. So we're just going to do that. And I think it makes it a little clearer where the tests live. Before, you might remember they were in each package. I thought that was a good idea. I've since changed my mind. So now the tests are here. You'll just create your file for tests and write your tests as we saw. You can use some of these other ones as examples. And then docs now also is going to have its own folder. Again, this is something that used to be down in the package. I thought that was a good idea in the past. I've since changed my mind, and I think we just have a docs folder. I think this makes everybody's life, mine included, a little bit simpler. So you can come in here. Here's our SP folder. Some of this is outdated. This is just us getting started. So if you see stuff in here that's outdated, you don't necessarily need to let us know. We probably know. If you have some time and want to update some of the stuff that's outdated, absolutely welcome that help. We can use all the help we can get on getting this stuff ready to go. So I've written this documentation thing ahead of time because I felt it might be super boring for you all to watch me write documentation. Doesn't make for the best TV. But so we've got a couple things going on here. And I'm going to hit this little preview thinger here so I can kind of see what's going on. We're trying to make things easy for people to understand. One of our big goals is, for those of you that were at the Collaboration Summit in Europe heard me say this, that our focus for the last couple of years has been on growth. We've achieved growth. We have fantastic usage numbers now. So now our focus is providing a better experience for folks coming new to the library or who have been using the library for a while and might not know of all the capabilities because we've never had the time or taken the time to document them before. So we want to make our documentation super easy and really better than it has been in the past, right? Like I've never said our documentation was perfect, and it certainly has room for improvement, and this is that opportunity to make that improvement, right? So we've got a couple little button things up here. You can just copy and paste these. So what we're saying is regional settings is invocable and does support selective imports. These both link to articles that I need to write at some point, so they link to a blank page. But in those pages, we'll describe what invocable means and what selective imports means, what those concepts mean. But that way we can do it once. We don't have to do it on every docs page, right? So we've got those tagged. I've got a table here that shows how you can do the different selective imports. And again, this is fine for here, and we'll describe more about what this means on the selective imports article. So don't worry about that exactly. But we're just showing here how to do these selective imports from the library, right? How to import things, and we'll take a look at that in 1 second. So, and then there's presets. Again, for those of you that were in Europe, this will be a bit of a repeat, but the packages, because we're doing selective imports, it felt mean to make everybody change all their code immediately to use selective imports, right? I'm not a mean guy, so we didn't do that. So what we came up with is this idea of presets. And so the all preset exports everything and basically gives you what the library, the SP library was before, with everything already attached to the SP constant. The core preset just does items, lists, sites, webs, and gets the SP constant wired up for just that stuff, right? These are just 2 examples. We could probably add more in the future. I don't want to add 1,000 presets because of some other work we're doing around how to build your own reusable package, which I'm not going to cover on this call, but presets. So that's what this is, talking about everything is in the all preset. And so for stuff like web, I would have listed the core preset here as well. So now we've got some code examples here. So we just jumped into this and said, here's how to get all the regional settings, and here's how to select only some of those settings, right? You might say to yourself, Patrick, this looks a lot like the tests that we did. So the way I do this, and the way I think is a nice, easy way to do this, is to write the tests in the docs at the same time and to use our ability to debug. So if you haven't ever looked at the debug launch folder, there's a main file here, and it has all this stuff. And then if we look at SP, this is where we can do some SP requests. So what I would do, or what I did, in fact, for regional settings was SP, web. Well, I don't have my regional settings, right? What do I do? This is where the selective imports come in. So I'm going to say import PnP, SP, source, regional settings. And now I have my regional settings property, and that's all been dynamically added onto my web object. I could also do just web. For regional settings, it only applies to web, so this doesn't really gain you anything. But there are other places like content types. You could just grab the content type functions for web or for list, for example. But so I've done my selective imports. Now I have my property. So I would do this. And now I can hit F5 and this will run. But first, I want to go to my little debug window and make sure you've picked debug. Not debug tests, not debug build system, but just debug. And we'll look at debug tests in a second. Time is flying. So I'll hit F5. This is going to run. We'll get our regional settings back. And you can see this is super complex. I'm just getting it, and I'm dumping it to the console so we can see it worked. And it worked. No, it worked. It worked. It worked. So we can see this is some logging happening. It worked. So this is how I also created those interfaces. I just copied this and made it into an interface. You can do the same thing if you find places where that could help. And so what I did is just go back and forth, write these examples, test them here, put them in the docs, write a test for it. Same thing for installed languages, time zones, and you can see we're trying to show a bit more of the library so we can say, hey, look, you can select stuff out of here, right? You can, this is getting by ID. This is calling something from the get by ID we just did, right? We've got a list of IDs here. So we're trying to be as helpful as we can. But again, this isn't a place I expect anybody to write 400,000 lines of samples and examples, right? It's not the best use of your time. And honestly, folks aren't going to read them. Folks want the basic stuff to get started, and that's good. This is another place, as we get issues come in, people have questions, we'll come in here and update the docs with a sample to fix some issue or to show how to do some capability that isn't already in the docs, right? Maybe it's some special case about how to do something with time zones, which I can't think of anything special with time zones, but and that's it. So I just went through, did my test, hit F5, ran them, and one thing you want to do is don't check in, because I made this mistake, don't check in any changes to this SP file. So you can just discard those. Another way to work is you could come in here and I could add a new file and call this regional settings.ts. I could do all my coding in here, like I would start with just, whoa, that's not the right file. I would just start with this, start with this, and then I would update this. I could change main to be my regional settings, and then my regional settings file will run, right? It's the exact same way the other file did. The git ignore is set up, so you can have any number of files in here, and they will get ignored. The only things that get included are sp main, graph, and this ts config. So you could have 30 different little testing files in here if you wanted. And then, but the same rules apply. Don't check in any changes to main because that'll mess up the next person down the line. I tripped up Julie by screwing up that exact thing. So just try and keep an eye out for that. That's something we'll check when we merge the pull requests. So we've removed comments. We've ensured the docs are updated. So the next, there's two things left. I think we'll just have time to do them. So one of the last things is to come to the issues list. And we're going to go back to the issues list. And there's one of the things we did is search for things with the label sample. And you're going to get some stuff here, right? None of this, I just know none of this has to do with regional settings. But for some of this, this is places where people have asked questions. Like here's, let's just, I don't remember what this is. Let's just have a look at it. Here's somebody saying, you know, here's how do I, to work with items in a batch, right? So we didn't have a great example of doing that. So for whoever ends up writing the batching article, this is a thing. You might come and look at this, then you might go look at this issue, kind of understand the questions. And look, Andrew, who always does these amazing examples, we can just steal his sample, right? Write a little documentation, a header above it, and be like, this is an example. What's this person? Yeah, so this is a guy, a guy asking how to set up a batch depends on another batch, right? So here's a sample to do that. So in your docs, you can just make a header that says how to depend on a batch, put this sample up there, link to this issue if you like, and you know, you're all set. So that's kind of what we mean by this one. So we're just trying to pull back out those places where we definitely had a gap in the docs and make sure we've closed that gap as we move to V2. And then finally, and this is kind of the most complicated step that is probably also the biggest pain in the bum, but you need to go through, and I happen to know with regional settings, there's been no changes for the last 3 years. But you want to look at the 1x branch and ensure any fixes, updates, and changes have been moved to the 2.0. So you kind of have to go line by line through the code. Most of it hasn't changed, but what's happened is this 2.0 branch, like I said, no longer is related to the dev 1.x branch. And I also branched it 4 or 5 months ago, 6 months ago at this point, maybe not that long, but a long time, long enough that stuff has changed, stuff has been improved. You know, we've had, 3 or 4 releases in that time. So you got to go through the code and really just kind of line by line review it. Most of it hasn't changed, but in some places you have, right? For one example was like the client-side pages. I had branched the V2 branch before we rewrote all the client-side pages stuff. So I had to bring all that work over, right? It just had to get done, right? It just takes some time and you just have to do it. So, hey, cool. I have done all my checklist. I feel really good about it. So now I'm going to go back to my code. And the last thing you want to do before you check all this in and submit a pull request, it's always a good idea, see what files you've changed. I've changed a few other files as I was going through this yesterday with Julie and Simon and David. I noticed a few things I wanted to correct. So you can ignore some of this, but for example, hey, here's our docs page for the settings file. It's a to-do, right? But it's going to remind us. So here's my docs. One last look at that. Looks good. Okay. This was me fixing a linting thing, so ignore that. You wouldn't have done that. Ignore that. So here's our types. Go through. My comments look good. My classes look good. You can see where I've moved comments around and things. You can see down here I've added some interfaces. But that's, so that's looking at this. Here's web. I made sure this was commented. Oh, I didn't mention this. So sorry. Real quick. In this, you have your index, which is your exports. You have your types, which is the classes and interfaces. And then you have one or more of these other files named like web or list. And these are the things that actually do the dynamic attaching of properties and methods to the interfaces. So like I said, this work has been done. You shouldn't have to refactor any of this, but have a look at it. And this is, again, some TypeScript juggling where you can actually augment this module. So we're saying declare this module here, and TypeScript is smart enough to actually merge these things together. And then we're going to say the interface and the interface here. We have to add our property to both of them just to make TypeScript happy. But this augments the actual interface people will see. You saw how that worked when we were trying to debug. And then this is us calling our little helper function to add a property. So if we go to that, I can't go to that. Yeah, sometimes that's... so here's our add property, which is really just doing a reflect define property on our prototype and adding that property. And you'll see in places, let me just show you this because some of you will see this. If we look at sharing, I'll have it, right? So if we look at web, we're actually then just also attaching methods right to the prototype of that underlying object. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the best way to do these dynamic methods and played with like putting stuff in arrays, doing all this kind of stuff. And then what I really settled on is JavaScript already has an object graph that's supported, and that's the prototype. So we're just going to use it. And so we're just attaching stuff to our prototype here. And so for the sharing, we've actually centralized everything and made things a little easier. But ignore sharing. I think Julie took sharing, so none of you have to worry about that. Looking through my files, I'm happy with my changes. I did a couple little things to the client-side pages tests, so ignore that. And then my regional settings tests, those look good. I feel good about what I've done. So now I need to check it in. Now I need to submit a pull request. So this is sort of the last step at doing one of these modules. So if you've never done a pull request before, never done any of this, let's walk through it. So the first thing I need to do is I need to do a git add. And you can add specific files, you can add directories. Git add dot is just going to add everything here. Before I do that, I always like to do this. Git status. That's a great command so you can see exactly what you're going to add and commit. And this to me is my final sort of mental checkpoint to say, okay, great, I haven't changed something I shouldn't have. I haven't changed like that SP launch file, for example. So I'm going to do a git add, and now you have to do a git commit, and that commit is going to be regional settings submodule. That's as complicated as it needs to be. If you like, you could put a 2.0.0 in front of this to help us understand. So we're going to commit, and now I'm going to push. So this push is pushing into my fork in GitHub. So the code now, if we go to GitHub, and we go to Patrick Rogers, and we go to, nope, why did it do that? Go to my fork of PnPjs. There we go. So if we look at my fork, we can actually see now, if we get into the correct branch, we can see in SP, under docs, for example, no, I'm sorry. I am just all over the place. Docs, SP. So you can see our regional settings page is here in my fork. So we need to get this from my fork into the main repo. So you can see here's my thing, forked from this thing. So the way we do that is create a pull request. So I'm going to say new pull request. And you're going to get this screen, which is going to tell you all your changes. You can review things again. But the important thing here is you're going from whatever you can call your dev v2 other stuff. You can create feature branches. I don't care. You work how you want to work, but target the dev v2 branch here. If you change it, for example, to dev, it's just going to tell you it can't merge, right? They're not related. So it's a little bit of a safety there. But so we'll just go to dev v2. This is telling me I'm able to merge. If it says you're not able to merge, that is okay. It's not the end of the world. But what you want to do is see if you can fix some of that stuff. Or it might be because of you started working, somebody else submitted a pull request, so you need to do what I talked about at the beginning, is pull down the upstream changes, merge them, and resubmit your pull request. So there'd be a button here to create your pull request. What's a little funky is I already had an open pull request, so the way GitHub works is it's become part of this pull request, which is fine in this case, because I'm reviewing these. But each pull request would please be one submodule. So you can see here's SPView submodule. Nanadeep did this. Haven't had a chance to review it yet. So what will happen then? You just go back to your issue. That was wherever my issue was. And I would say in here, I would say, hey guys, hey folks, PR submitted and ready for review. Great. And so somebody, David, Simon, Julie, me, will come through and say, hey, thanks, that's great, really appreciate it. I'll give myself a thumbs up. Good job, Patrick. And change this to, actually, this will remain in progress for now. We'll review your pull requests when we have time. So don't, these have been sitting here for a while. We're going to get them reviewed. Don't stress about that. It's more of a free time issue to get these reviewed. So because there's a lot to review, right? All the stuff we've just gone over. So we'll get these reviewed. We'll get these merged. If you want to do another thing and submit another pull request or something, you can let us know and we can sort of jump in our priority reviewing your submodule. I'm going to try and get to these next week, I hope. I'll have some time to do that. And then your issue will move through. We have a project here. I think this is all public. I'm pretty sure this is all public. So you can see where your issues are in the tree of stuff. So we have a volunteer who offered to review the docs. So your regional settings will then move over here, ready to review docs. And then we'll move it to final review, and then move it to ensure attribution, so we can make sure everybody gets credit for the work they've done, because we want to not miss anybody. And then finally, it'll end up on done. And that'll be that. So with that, I will stop. I have 1 minute for questions. So any questions from anybody? I'll bring this back over here. Let's see, any questions? Yes, we are going to get this onto YouTube probably early next week, I'm thinking. So we'll see. Any other questions as we finish up here? Cool. Well, with that, I'll just say thank you to all of you for joining this call. I really appreciate it. Appreciate your interest in helping us. I'm really excited to get you all involved. And then if you have questions, like I said, reach out to pick one of the issues, comment on there with your questions, your ideas, whatever. Would love to hear them. And then would be excited to get as many of you involved, either the folks that made the call or those of you watching this at a later date. Would love to get you involved and love to get you helping out. So please, if you're interested, just reach out or just pick an issue, and look forward to working with you. So thanks, everybody. I really appreciate everybody, your offer to help and your interest in helping. It's really exciting to see that. So V2 will be our best release ever, and it's going to be a big credit to all of you out there in the community helping to make that happen. So everybody have a great rest of your day, rest of your Friday, or rest of your whatever day it is when you're watching this, and we'll all talk soon. Thanks all. Bye.